The windows of the Slytherin common room rippled with an otherworldly green light, filtering the winter afternoon through meters of lake water above. Draco Malfoy pressed his palm against the cold glass, watching a pike glide past with lazy indifference, its scales catching the dim light like scattered coins. Beyond the fish, through the murky depths, snowflakes drifted downward in slow motion, before dissolving into the black water, a silent storm that would never reach them here, so far below the castle grounds. He'd always found something oddly peaceful about the dungeons in winter, while Gryffindors huddled in their tower with its draughty windows and spectacular views, and Ravenclaws debated philosophy in their airy common room. Slytherins descended into the earth's embrace. The cold here felt different, not the biting wind of exposed heights, but the steady, ancient chill of stone that had stood for 1,000 years. Honestly, Crabbe, even a first year could manage a decent incendio by now. Pansy Parkinson's voice cut through Draco's reverie, sharp with amusement. He turned from the window to see her perched on the arm of a leather sofa, watching Vincent Crabbe aim his wand at icicle that had formed overnight along the edge of a silver sconce. The dungeons were prone to such things in deep winter, moisture seeping through ancient stone, freezing in the perpetual chill despite the roaring fireplaces the house elves maintained. Crabbe's face scrunched in concentration, his wand hand remarkably steady despite Pansy's commentary. "Incendio," he muttered, and a small jet of flame spurted from his wand tip. It hit the icicle at an angle, and rather than melting cleanly, the ice simply cracked and crashed to the floor in jagged pieces. "Brilliant," Blaise Zabini drawled from his position, sprawled across an armchair near the fire. "You've mastered the art of breaking things without actually warming them. Very useful life skill." "Let's see you do better," Gregory Goyle spoke up, his voice a low rumble. He'd been sitting so quietly in the corner that Draco had almost forgotten he was there, methodically working his way through what looked like leftover Christmas pudding. Blaise unfolded himself from the chair with theatrical grace, his dark skin gleaming in the firelight as he approached another icicle formation near the opposite wall. "The trick," he said, in the tone of someone explaining something obvious, "is sustained heat rather than a burst. You need to actually melt it, not blast it." He pointed his wand with a casual flick. "Incendio." His flame was smaller than Crabbe's, more controlled, a steady stream of orange heat that played across the ice. For a moment, it seemed to be working. Water began trickling down the stone. Then the flame sputtered, died, and the trickle froze solid again, forming a new icicle even as they watched. Pansy's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh yes, masterful. Truly, your technique is beyond reproach." "It's colder than usual," Blaise said defensively, returning to his chair. "Even with the fires going constantly, you can feel it. The whole dungeon's freezing from the inside out." Draco had noticed that too. The common room was never exactly warm. Slytherins took a certain pride in their tolerance for discomfort, as if physical coldness somehow sharpened mental acuity. But this winter felt different. The chill seemed to seep through the flagstones themselves, rising up through shoe leather and thick wool socks. Even now, with 3 fireplaces roaring and a dozen enchanted torches blazing in their brackets, he could see his breath misting faintly in the air. "The house elves are doing their best," Pansy said, gesturing toward the nearest fireplace, where the logs crackled with an almost desperate intensity. I saw one this morning actually layering warming charms on the carpets. When was the last time they had to do that? Never in my memory, Draco admitted, finally moving away from the window. His fingers were numb from the glass, and he flexed them as he crossed to the fire. The common room was emptier than usual. Most students had gone home for the winter holidays, leaving only a handful of Slytherins scattered across the green-lit space. The Yule decorations still hung from the vaulted ceiling. Silver serpents that twisted lazily through the air, their scales catching the firelight. Garlands of holly with leaves so dark green they were nearly black, and suspended ice sculptures that refused to melt despite the room's warmth, casting prismatic shadows across the stone walls. Theo Nod sat at one of the study tables, his quill scratching steadily across parchment as he worked through what was undoubtedly extra potions research. Millicent Bulstrode had claimed an entire sofa for herself and a stack of Witch Weekly magazines. Daphne Greengrass and her younger sister Astoria occupied the window seats, speaking in low voices while watching the lake's inhabitants drift past. It was a scene of quiet occupation, the kind of peaceful winter afternoon that should have felt comfortable, restful even. But there was something else in the air tonight, something Draco couldn't quite name. A tension, perhaps, or an anticipation, as if the dungeon itself were holding its breath. "Do you ever wonder," Pansy said suddenly, her voice losing its mocking edge, "why Salazar Slytherin built our common room down here? I mean, really think about it. The other houses got towers or cozy spaces near the kitchens, and we got a cave under a lake." "It's not a cave," Goyle said, through a mouthful of pudding. "It's distinguished." Blaise snorted. "It's strategic, hidden, defensible, separate from the rest of the castle. Very Slytherin." "But cold," Crabbe added, aiming his wand at yet another icicle. This time, his flame was even weaker, barely singing the ice before fizzling out entirely. Draco studied the room with fresh eyes, trying to imagine the founder's intentions. The space was undeniably grand. High ceilings carved from living rock, elegant furniture that had been renewed countless times over the centuries, but always in the same style. Those magnificent windows looking out into the lake's mysterious depths. Everything was green and silver, dark wood and darker stone, shadows and secret corners. It felt like a throne room buried in the earth, or a dragon's hoard hidden from the sun. "Maybe he wanted us to remember," Draco found himself saying. The words surprised him even as he spoke them, that we're different, apart, that we have to be harder, colder, more resilient because we live in the depths while others bask in the light. Pansy's dark eyes fixed on him with unusual intensity. "That's rather poetic for you, Draco." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just thinking aloud." "No, but you're right," Blaise said, sitting forward in his chair. "Slytherin House has always been about that separation. Purebloods maintaining their standards, cunning and ambition over bravery and loyalty and all that rot. We're supposed to be the cold ones, the calculating ones." He gestured at the icicles hanging from various surfaces around the room. "Maybe this is just appropriate, atmospheric." "Atmospheric," Crabbe repeated dubiously, still trying to vanquish icicles with increasingly pathetic bursts of flame. "My feet are numb through my boots. That's not atmosphere. That's just miserable." A house elf appeared, with a soft pop near the main fireplace, startling several students. The little creature, Draco recognized him as Nipsey, one of the elves assigned specifically to Slytherin House, carried an armload of blankets that seemed impossibly large for his small frame. Without a word, he began distributing them to students, draping thick wool over shoulders and laps with careful attention. "Nipsey is sorry," the elf squeaked when he reached their group. "Nipsey and the others is doing everything to keep young masters and mistresses warm, but the dungeons is not listening properly. Very unusual, very concerning." "What do you mean, not listening?" Pansy asked, accepting a blanket and immediately wrapping it around herself. The elf's enormous eyes grew even wider. "The warming charms, miss. Usually they is sinking into the stones, spreading through the walls like butter on warm bread, yes. But now," he wrung his small hands anxiously, "now the cold is pushing back. The dungeons is wanting to be cold, if Nipsey may say so." "Dungeons don't want things," Blaze said dismissively. "They're just stone and space." But Nipsey shook his head vigorously, ears flapping. "Begging Mr. Zabini's pardon, but Hogwarts is always wanting things. The castle has opinions. Yes, it does. And right now, the dungeons is remembering something from long ago." Before anyone could question him further, the elf popped away, leaving them staring at each other in confusion. "Well, that wasn't ominous at all," Pansy muttered, pulling her blanket tighter. Draco turned back to the window, that strange feeling of anticipation growing stronger. The lake water seemed darker now as afternoon bled toward evening, the green light deepening to near black. The fish had vanished, retreating to wherever fish went when winter truly set in. Even the falling snow above had slowed, individual flakes taking long, lazy seconds to spiral down through the water. And then he saw it, so faint he almost dismissed it as imagination. A shimmer in the water, moving against the current. Not a fish or a creature, but something else. A ripple of light, silver green and ancient, that seemed to emanate from the castle walls themselves before dissipating into the depths. "Did you see that?" he asked, pressing closer to the glass. "See what?" Pansy had joined him at the window, her breath fogging the surface. There was a light, like, I don't know, like magic, but old magic, really old. Blaze was there now too, peering into the murky water. "I don't see anything," but Goyle spoke up from across the room, his voice unusually thoughtful. "The icicles are growing faster. Look." He was right. Draco could see it now. The formations they'd been trying to melt were reforming, spreading, delicate fingers of ice reaching across stone surfaces with visible speed. Along the windows, frost was beginning to creep inward from the edges, forming patterns that seemed almost deliberate. Not random crystallization, but shapes, curves and angles that suggested meaning, like the beginning of words in a language he didn't recognize. "Magic doesn't just happen," Pansy said quietly, but her voice carried an edge of uncertainty. "Not without a reason. Not in Hogwarts." Draco thought about Nipsey's words, the castle remembering something. He thought about the 1,000 years of history compressed into these stones, the generations of Slytherins who had lived and learned in this very room. All that accumulated magic, all those winters endured in the depths beneath the lake. What did dungeons remember? What could make stone itself want to freeze? The fire popped loudly, sending up a shower of sparks, and several students jumped. The evening was settling in properly now, that peculiar dungeon twilight where the distinction between afternoon and night became meaningless. Time felt strange down here, always, too slow and too fast at once, marked only by meals and classes and the rhythms of the school day above. "I think," Draco said slowly, still watching the frost patterns spread across the window, "that Nipsey might be right. Something is happening. Something the castle is trying to tell us." "The castle can write us a letter like everyone else," Blade joked, but his heart wasn't in it. They could all feel it now. That presence, that attention focused on their common room like a held breath about to be released. Outside the window, impossibly deep in the black water, another shimmer of silver-green light pulsed once and vanished, and the temperature dropped another degree, sending a collective shiver through every Slytherin in the room. Whatever the castle remembered, whatever ancient magic stirred in these stones, winter had only just begun. Morning in the Slytherin dungeons arrived not with sunrise, they were too deep for that, but with the gradual brightening of enchanted torches and the house elves' quiet ministrations to the fireplaces. Draco woke to a cold so profound it seemed to have seeped into his bones overnight. His breath hung visible in the air above his four-poster bed, and when he pushed back the heavy curtains, he found Crab and Goyle already awake, huddled in their blankets and staring at something with unusual focus. "You need to see this," Goyle said, his voice hushed. Draco pulled on his warmest robes, the thick winter ones his mother had sent with warming charm sewn into the lining, and followed their gaze to the tall windows of their dormitory. His breath caught. The glass was covered in frost, but not the random, delicate patterns he'd seen on windows in the manor during cold snaps. These were deliberate, precise, symbols and shapes interlocked across the surface, like an intricate puzzle. Each line perfectly formed, each curve mathematically exact. They seemed to shimmer with their own faint light, silver against the green-tinted glass. "It's on all the windows," Crab said. Theo checked the other dormitories, every single one. Draco moved closer, his scholarly instincts overriding his discomfort with the cold. The symbols weren't random. He could see that immediately. Some resembled runes he'd studied in ancient runes class, though twisted somehow. Older versions, perhaps. Others looked like nothing he'd ever encountered. Geometric patterns that hurt slightly to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than his eyes could properly process. "Is it a message?" he asked, tracing one symbol with his finger, just above the glass surface, careful not to touch and potentially disturb it. "If it is, it's in a language none of us can read." Theodore Knott appeared in the doorway, already dressed and looking like he hadn't slept. His sharp features were even more pronounced than usual, shadowed with exhaustion or excitement, possibly both. "I've been through every reference book I could think of. The closest match is Proto-Celtic runic script, but even that's not quite right. These are older, much older." "Founder era old," Draco suggested. Theo's eyes gleamed. Possibly older than that. They made their way to the common room together, finding it already occupied despite the early hour. The cold had apparently driven everyone from their beds, seeking the marginal warmth of the communal fires. Pansy sat curled in an armchair near the largest fireplace, wrapped in what looked like 3 separate blankets, while Blaze paced back and forth in front of the lake windows, studying them intently. The frost patterns here were even more elaborate. The massive windows that looked out into the lake were covered entirely, transforming them into frosted panes of bewildering complexity. But it was what lay beyond the frost that drew Draco's attention. The lake water itself had changed. The usual murky green had lightened to an almost crystalline clarity, and he could see far deeper than ever before. The lake bed was visible, covered in what looked like pale sand or silt, and moving across it were shapes he couldn't quite identify. Not the grindylows that occasionally pressed their grotesque faces to the glass, and not the ordinary fish. These were larger, slower, more deliberate in their movements. "The giant squid hasn't moved in hours," Daphne Greengrass said, from her position by another window. Her younger sister Astoria stood beside her, pressed close for warmth. "It's just sitting there on the bottom, like it's waiting for something." Draco looked where she pointed and saw the massive creature, its tentacles coiled beneath it, perfectly still. Even as he watched, small fish swam directly past its head without fleeing. The squid's usual playfulness, its tendency to interact with students who waved at it through the glass, had vanished entirely. "Everything's acting strange," Millicent Bulstrode spoke up from her corner. "I saw a grindylow swimming in formation with a fish. Grindylows don't school with fish. They eat fish. The merpeople too," Astoria added, her voice small but certain. "I saw 3 of them earlier, before the sun was properly up. They were swimming along the castle walls, touching the stones, like they were, I don't know, reading them." Pansy stood abruptly, letting her blankets fall. "Right. This is officially beyond weird and well into actually concerning. We need to figure out what's happening before..." "Before what?" Blaze interrupted. "Before we freeze to death in our own common room, before the lake decides to do something even stranger. We don't even know what we're dealing with. Then we research," Draco said firmly. The Malfoy training, years of his father's insistence on knowledge as power, on understanding before acting, kicked in automatically. Theo's already started. "We need to organize properly. Divide the work." "Oh, wonderful," Pansy said, but there was relief in her sarcasm. "Draco's in delegation mode. Should I take notes?" Despite the tension, several students smiled. It was such a Slytherin response to mystery. Not panic, but organization. Not fear, but strategy. They gathered around one of the study tables, and Draco found himself naturally taking charge, assigning tasks with the efficiency he'd learned from years of watching his father manage complex social situations. Theo would continue with the historical research, focusing on Hogwarts' founding and any records of unusual magical phenomena in the dungeons. Daphne and Astoria would monitor the lake, keeping detailed notes on any changes in the water or creature behavior. Millicent would track the house elves' comings and goings, try to gather more information about what they were sensing. "And us?" Crabbe asked, gesturing to himself and Goyle. Draco considered them thoughtfully. People consistently underestimated Crabbe and Goyle, assuming their physical bulk meant intellectual emptiness. But Draco had known them since childhood and understood something others missed. They noticed things, physical things, spatial things, the kind of concrete details that more theoretical minds often overlooked. "You two map it," he said. "Document where every icicle forms, where the frost is thickest, where it's thinnest. Look for patterns in the physical space. If this is some kind of enchantment, it has to have an anchor point, a center." Goyle nodded slowly, and Draco saw understanding dawn in his eyes. like when we were 7, and you made us find all your father's listening charms in the manor. Exactly like that. What about us? Pansy asked, indicating herself and Blay. We're going to do what Slytherins do best, Draco said with a slight smile. We're going to talk to people who are here before us and find out what they know, the portraits. The Slytherin common room had fewer portraits than other parts of the castle. Salazar Slytherin had apparently valued privacy over decoration, but the ones that existed were old, really old. Former heads of house going back centuries, a few notable alumni, and in one shadowy corner, a portrait so ancient and water-damaged that the figure within was barely visible. They started with the most recent, a portrait of Horace Slughorn from his first tenure as head of house, decades before his current return. The painted Slughorn was sleeping, snoring gently with his walrus moustache fluttering. But Pansy woke him with a polite cough that somehow managed to sound sharp. Eh? What? Is it time for the party already? The portrait Slughorn blinked, focusing on them. Oh, students, current students. How delightful. What can I do for you, young people? The common room is freezing, Blaze said bluntly. Frost patterns on all the windows, strange behavior from the lake creatures, and the house elves say the castle is remembering something. We were hoping you might know what they meant. Slughorn's painted face creased in thought. Remembering? Ah, well, you know, I do recall something. Back in, must have been winter of 52. We had an unusual cold snap. Nothing quite like this, mind you, but the dungeons did get rather frosty. Old Professor Beery, who was head of house then, said something curious. He said Hogwarts had a long memory, and some winters reminded it of the very first winter. But he'd been at the cooking sherry, so I didn't put much stock in it. The very first winter, Draco pressed, when the castle was built? I suppose so. Can't say for certain. You'd need to ask someone who was around for the founding, and good luck with that. Slughorn chuckled at his own joke. Then his expression softened. Though, if you're serious about this research, you might try old Rayburn. He gestured to the nearly invisible portrait in the corner. That one's older than anyone can remember. Barely speaks anymore. But when he does, well, he knew the castle when it was young. They approached the damaged portrait carefully. The paint was so faded that only the suggestion of a figure remained. A tall, thin man in robes that might have once been green, standing in what might have been a corridor. The face was almost entirely gone, worn away by time and moisture. Excuse me, Pansy said softly. Professor Rayburn, we need your help. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, the figure shifted. A voice emerged, thin and distant, like wind through ancient stones. The lake remembers. They all leaned closer. Draco felt his heart beating faster. What does it remember? He asked. Cold, the first cold, when Salazar walked the shores, before the walls were raised. The lake was here first, older than Hogwarts, older than wizards. It remembers when the world was ice. The voice faded, and the figure in the portrait became still once more. That was deeply unhelpful, Blaze muttered, but Draco shook his head. No, think about it. The lake was here before the castle, before the founders. Salazar Slytherin didn't just build our common room underwater. He built it in something that was already ancient, something that has its own magic. And now that magic is waking up, Pansy finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. That's what the house elves meant. The castle isn't just remembering, the lake is, and our common room is built right into it. Theo burst through the entrance at that moment, nearly skidding on a patch of ice that had formed near the doorway. He was clutching several books, their pages marked with scraps of parchment. "I found something," he gasped. "In Hogwarts. A history. The footnotes, not the main text. There's a reference to Salazar Slytherin, spending his first winter at Hogwarts, living by the lake before the castle was finished. He slept in a cave on the shore and claimed the lake spoke to him in dreams." "Spoke to him about what?" Draco demanded. "It doesn't say. But there's another reference in a much older text, pre-medieval magical sites of Britain. It mentions this lake specifically as a place of power, sacred to ancient peoples long before wizards. The kind of place where the barriers between magic and nature are thin." Millicent appeared from the direction of the kitchens, slightly out of breath. "The house elves are preparing for something. They won't say what, but they're gathering supplies, extra blankets, warming drafts, even moving some furniture. When I asked Nipsey what they were preparing for, he just said the awakening." "The awakening of what?" Pansy asked, but they all knew. No one had an answer. Crabbe and Goyle had been working silently while the others researched, and now Goyle spread out a rough map of the common room he'd drawn on parchment. He'd marked every location where ice had formed, every frosted window, every cold spot. The marks weren't random. They formed a pattern, lines of concentration that all led back to a single point. "Here," Goyle said, pointing to a spot on his map that corresponded to a section of the common room they rarely used. It was a small alcove near the main windows, shadowed and easily overlooked, containing only a single ancient chair and a small table. They moved to the location together, a group of Slytherins united by curiosity and concern. The alcove was even colder than the rest of the room, their breath hanging in thick clouds. The frost here was so heavy that it had formed actual icicles hanging from the stone ceiling, and the walls glittered with crystalline patterns. Draco knelt down, running his hand along the floor. The stone here felt different, smoother, older, worn by countless feet over countless years, and carved into it, barely visible under a layer of frost, was a symbol, a serpent coiled around itself, its tail in its mouth, encircling what looked like waves or water. "Salazar Slytherin's personal seal," Theo breathed. "I've seen it in books. This must have been his spot, where he sat when he lived down here." As if in response to the discovery, the temperature dropped sharply. The windows began to frost over more heavily, the patterns growing more complex, more insistent. And deep in the lake, something vast shifted, sending ripples through the water that made the glass shudder. Whatever was awakening, whatever the lake remembered, it was connected to this place, to Salazar Slytherin's original presence here before Hogwarts was fully built, when he'd lived beside these waters and listened to their ancient magic. And now, 1,000 years later, that magic was speaking again. Draco looked at his friends, at Pansy's sharp intelligence, Blaze's analytical mind, Theo's scholarly dedication, Millicent's practical observations, Crabbe and Goyle's unexpected attention to detail. They were Slytherins, sorted into this house because of qualities Salazar himself had valued: ambition, cunning, resourcefulness. But perhaps he'd valued something else too. Perhaps he'd chosen the lake, chosen to build his house in the depths, for a reason they were only beginning to understand. "We need to find out what Salazar learned from the lake," Draco said quietly, "because I think it's trying to teach us the same lesson." Outside the windows, the giant squid finally moved, its tentacles unfurling slowly as it began to swim upward toward the frozen surface far above. And in the alcove where Salazar Slytherin had once sat and dreamed, the frost patterns began to glow with that same silver-green light Draco had seen the night before. The castle was remembering, the lake was awakening, and somehow they were meant to understand why. The discovery of Salazar Slytherin's seal had changed everything. What had begun as an unusually cold winter morning had transformed into something far more significant, a mystery that reached back to Hogwarts' very foundations. Draco found himself unable to concentrate on anything else, his mind circling endlessly around the image of that serpent coiled around waves, the frost glowing with ancient magic. By midday, the common room had become an impromptu research center. Students who had initially planned to spend the holiday sleeping late and avoiding homework now gathered in small clusters, sharing theories and observations. Even the Greengrass sisters, who typically kept to themselves, had joined the broader effort, Astoria keeping meticulous notes while Daphne sketched the frost patterns with surprising artistic skill. Draco stood once again in Salazar's alcove, staring down at the seal. The frost had thickened around it overnight, forming a perfect circle that outlined the carving. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache, the kind of beauty that came from magic so old and pure it had transcended mere utility to become art. Still brooding? Pansy appeared at his elbow, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate that she'd somehow convinced the house elves to send up. "You've been standing here for 20 minutes. The seal isn't going to suddenly start talking to you." "How do you know?" Draco accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his cold fingers around the warm ceramic. "Everything else in this dungeon seems to have an opinion lately." She had a point, though. Standing and staring wasn't getting them anywhere. They needed more information, and there was one group in the castle who knew more about Hogwarts' inner workings than anyone, even the professors. "We need to talk to the house elves properly," Draco said, making a decision. "Not just intercept them when they're working. Actually sit down and ask them what they know." Pansy raised an eyebrow. "Since when do Malfoys sit down with house elves? Since the alternative is freezing to death while mysteries multiply around us," Draco thought, but didn't say. His father's voice echoed in his mind. Malfoys don't lower themselves. But his father wasn't here, and his father's rigid rules hadn't prepared him for ancient lake magic and awakening castles. "Since now," he said simply. They found Blay and convinced him to join them. His practical mind would help keep the conversation focused. And together, they made their way through the dungeons toward the kitchens. It felt strange walking these corridors with purpose rather than just passing through on the way to class. Draco noticed details he'd overlooked for years. The way certain stones were worn smoother than others, suggesting they'd been touched repeatedly over centuries. The patches where the wall color changed slightly, indicating repairs or additions. The subtle variations in temperature as they moved through different sections. The kitchen entrance was hidden behind a painting of fruit, Tickle the pear, and they descended into a space of organized chaos. House elves moved in coordinated swarms, preparing meals, cleaning dishes, organizing stores. The heat from multiple ovens made the kitchen almost uncomfortably warm after the dungeon's chill, a stark reminder of how cold their common room had become. Young masters, a house elf, Draco didn't recognize, appeared before them, wringing his hands anxiously. Young masters shouldn't be in the kitchens. Is something wrong with the food? Is there complaints? No complaints, Blaze said smoothly. We're looking for Nipsey. Is he here? The elf's ears drooped with relief. Nipsey is checking the warming charms in the Slytherin dormitories, sir. Nipsey is very concerned about young masters and mistresses being cold. Very concerned indeed. Could someone fetch him? Draco asked, then added, surprising himself, please. The magic word seemed to startle the elf, who immediately popped away. While they waited, Draco observed the kitchen's operations. He'd never paid much attention to house elves before, accepting their service as simply the way things were. But watching them now, he saw the complexity of their work, the skill and coordination required to feed an entire castle, the way they anticipated needs before they arose. Nipsey appeared with a soft pop, and his large eyes went even wider when he saw them. Young Mr. Malfoy, sir, and Mr. Zabini and Miss Parkinson. Is the common room too cold still? Nipsey has been adding charms every hour, but the stones, they is not cooperating. That's what we wanted to ask you about, Draco said. He glanced around at the busy kitchen, elves rushing past in every direction. Is there somewhere we could talk, somewhere quieter? Nipsey hesitated, clearly uncertain about the protocol for having students request private conversations with house elves. Finally, he nodded and led them to a small side room, barely more than a cupboard, really, where clean linens were stored. It smelled of soap and lavender, and while cramped for 3 students and 1 house elf, it offered privacy. They settled themselves on some folded tablecloths, and Draco noticed that for the first time in his life, he was sitting at eye level with a house elf, rather than looking down. The perspective was oddly unsettling. Nipsey, he began, choosing his words carefully. Yesterday, you said the dungeons were remembering something. We found evidence that you're right. There's ancient magic activating, connected to Salazar Slytherin himself. We need to understand what's happening. Can you help us? The elf's ears quivered with what might have been fear or excitement, possibly both. Nipsey is not supposed to speak of castle secrets, he said in a small voice. House elves is knowing things, yes, but house elves is not for telling. The castle is trying to tell us something already, Pansy pointed out. Through the frost patterns, the behavior of the lake creatures, all of it. You just be helping us understand what it's saying. Nipsey wrung his hands for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting impulses. Finally, he seemed to come to a decision. House elves is caring for Hogwarts for a very long time, he began, his voice barely above a whisper. Before there was house elves serving the founders, even. When the castle was first being built, house elves was here, helping with the magic, weaving the enchantments into the stones. House elves is part of Hogwarts, and Hogwarts is part of house elves. We is feeling what the castle feels. And what is the castle feeling now? Blaze asked. Remembering, Nipsey said, using that word again. Every winter the castle remembers the first winter, but some winters when the cold is very deep, when the lake freezes thick, the remembering is stronger. The castle dreams, young masters. It dreams of when it was new, when the founders walked its halls and shaped its magic. And the dungeons, they dreams of Salazar Slytherin. Draco leaned forward. Why the dungeons specifically? Because Salazar Slytherin lived here first, Nipsey explained, his large eyes distant, as if seeing into the past. Before the castle was finished, before all the stones was laid, he made his home by the lake. He lived in a cave, the cave that later became your common room. He spent a whole winter there, studying the lake's magic, learning its secrets. And the lake, Nipsey's voice dropped even lower. The lake loved him for it. The words sent a shiver down Draco's spine that had nothing to do with cold. Loved him, Pansy repeated. The lake is just water. How can it love? The lake is older than wizards, miss, Nipsey said, with more authority than Draco had ever heard from a house elf. It has its own magic, wild magic from before wands and spells. Salazar Slytherin, he understood this. He didn't try to control the lake. He listened to it, and in return, the lake shared its power with him. That's why he built Slytherin House here, in the depths, not to hide away, but to stay close to the magic that taught him. What kind of magic? Draco asked. Nipsey's expression became troubled. Deep magic, old magic, the kind that's not about power or winning, but about home, about belonging, about knowing your place in the world and being content there. He looked up at them with those enormous eyes. Salazar Slytherin, he was not always the cold, ambitious wizard the stories say. Once, he was just a young man who sat by a lake and learned to listen. The silence that followed was profound. Draco felt something shifting in his understanding, like ice cracking on a frozen pond. All his life, he'd been taught about Salazar Slytherin's greatness, his power, his cunning, his pure blood ideals, his ambition. But this picture Nipsey painted was different, smaller somehow, and yet more meaningful. Is that what the lake is trying to teach us now? He asked quietly. To listen? The lake is reminding the castle of that first winter, Nipsey said, when Salazar Slytherin learned the most important lesson. House elves has been tending this memory for 1,000 years, keeping it safe in the stones, in the water, in the foundations of Slytherin House. Most winters, it sleeps. But when the cold comes deep enough, when the lake freezes thick enough, it wakes. And what happens when it wakes? Blaze asked. It offers the lesson again, Nipsey said simply, to new Slytherins, to see if they will listen like Salazar did, or if they has forgotten how. Draco sat back, his mind racing, an enchantment that activated periodically, teaching a lesson, preserving something Salazar Slytherin himself had valued enough to weave into the very foundation of his house. But what was the lesson exactly? What had the young Salazar learned during that winter by the lake? Nipsey, Pansy said carefully, do you know where we could find more information? Did Salazar leave any records of that time? The elf's ears perked up. There is something, he said hesitantly. House elves is not supposed to know about it, but house elves knows everything that happens in Hogwarts. In the alcove, the place where Salazar used to sit, there is a hidden space behind the stone with his seal. He left something there, long ago. House elves has kept it safe, kept it dry, kept it preserved, for students who was clever enough to look. Draco's heart leapt. A journal, notes. Nipsey is not knowing exactly what it is, the elf admitted. House elves never opened it, but it has been waiting there for a very long time. They thanked Nipsey profusely. another novelty that made the elf's ears flush pink, and practically ran back to the Slytherin common room. The other students looked up as they burst in, clearly sensing something had changed. "Theo, Millicent, everyone, the alcove, now," Draco said, already moving. They gathered around Salazar's seal, and Draco knelt down, examining the stone more carefully. If there was a hidden space, there had to be a way to open it. He pressed on the seal itself, traced the outline of the serpent, tried speaking in Parseltongue, though he'd never mastered that particular family gift. "Try asking," Goyle suggested unexpectedly. "If the castle's awake and trying to teach us something, maybe it wants to help." It was such a simple idea that Draco almost dismissed it. But then he remembered Nipsey's words about Salazar listening rather than controlling, and decided it was worth attempting. "We're here to learn," he said aloud, feeling only slightly ridiculous. "We want to understand. Will you show us?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then the frost on the wall behind the alcove began to glow, that silver-green light pulsing like a heartbeat. The stone itself seemed to sigh, and a section of the wall simply opened, not with the grinding of hidden mechanisms, but as smoothly as a door on well-oiled hinges, revealing a shallow niche. Inside, preserved by magic and house elf care for 1,000 years, was a small leather-bound journal. Draco reached in with trembling hands and lifted it out. The leather was supple despite its age, the pages within crisp and perfectly preserved. On the cover, in faded silver ink, were words in an old-fashioned script. "Lessons from Deep Water, the Winter Journal of SS." "Salazar Slytherin's personal journal," Theo breathed, reverence in his voice. "From his first winter at Hogwarts. This is incredible." Draco opened it carefully to the first page. The handwriting was precise, but not rigid, scholarly, but warm. It began simply, "I have built my cave into something livable, though crude by the standards I was raised to expect. The lake is my window, my companion, my teacher. The other founders work on the castle above. Great magics, powerful wards, impressive enchantments. But here below, I am learning something different, something the lake whispers in the dark hours. It speaks of magic that has nothing to do with power and everything to do with..." The entry broke off there, continuing on the next page. But Draco's hands had started shaking too much to turn it immediately. "With what?" Pansy demanded. "Everything to do with what?" Draco forced himself to turn the page, and together they read, "With home. The lake tells me that magic, at its deepest level, is about creating sanctuary. Not fortresses or demonstrations of power, but places where one can rest truly, without armor, without pretense. Places where even serpents, cold-blooded, cautious, cunning, can be warm." The words seemed to resonate through the alcove, and Draco felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Around them, the other Slytherins had gone quiet, listening. "The others think I'm odd, spending my winter in a cave," the journal continued. "Godric jests that I am becoming a hermit. Rowena questions the efficiency of my living arrangements. Helga worries I am not eating properly. But they do not understand. This is not about isolation or hardship. This is about listening to magic that existed before us and will exist after us. This is about learning what the earth itself can teach. Today, the lake showed me something. When I pressed my hand to the ice forming on the shore, I felt connection to every drop of water in this lake, to every creature that lives within it, to the stone beneath and the sky above. For a moment, I was not Salazar Slytherin, ambitious heir to an old family, determined to make his mark on history. I was simply part of something, part of a pattern older and wiser than any spell I could cast. And I realized this is what I want to give to my students, not just knowledge or power or the ability to succeed in a world that will often be hostile to magical folk. I want to give them this, the knowledge that no matter how cold the world becomes, how isolated they feel, how much armor they must wear to survive, there is a place where they can rest, where the depths hold warmth, not danger, where serpents coil not to strike, but to conserve heat, where ambition can sleep for a while without shame. Draco's vision blurred slightly. He blinked, surprised to find his eyes wet. I am building this common room not as a fortress, but as a hearth, Salazar had written, deep in the earth, beneath the lake, where the world's oldest magics run strong. And I am weaving into it an enchantment that will activate when my students need it most, when the cold grows deep, when they have forgotten how to rest, when they think strength means never lowering their guard. In those moments, the lake will remember for them. It will teach them what it taught me, that there is no shame in seeking warmth, no weakness in needing home. The journal entry ended there, but there were many more pages filled with Salazar's observations about the lake, his developing friendship with the merpeople, his experiments with the castle's foundations. It would take hours to read through it all. But the central message was clear. He wasn't trying to make us cold, Millicent said softly. He was trying to give us a permission to be warm. To rest, Daphne added. To let our guards down, at least here, at least with each other. To remember that ambition isn't the same as isolation, Astoria finished. Draco looked around at his housemates, at Pansy with her sharp tongue that hid desperate insecurity, Blay with his careful detachment that protected a surprisingly tender heart, Theo with his scholarly obsessions that kept him from having to deal with his father's darkness, Millicent with her gruff exterior masking genuine kindness, the Greengrass sisters with their pure-blood elegance concealing the weight of family expectations, Crabbe and Goyle, who had learned early that being underestimated was safer than being truly seen. They were all cold, not because of the temperature, though that was certainly uncomfortable, but because being a Slytherin meant learning to protect yourself, to calculate, to hold pieces of yourself back. It meant living behind walls of ambition and cunning, never quite trusting, never quite resting. And Salazar Slytherin, 1,000 years ago, had known his students would struggle with this, had built them a sanctuary in the depths and enchanted it to wake when they needed reminding. You are allowed to be warm. You are allowed to be home. So what do we do now? Crabbe asked practically. How do we activate the rest of the enchantment? How do we accept the lesson? Draco looked down at the journal in his hands, at the words written by a young wizard who had sat in this very spot and learned to listen to ancient magic. I think, he said slowly, we have to do what he did. We have to stop trying to control everything. We have to listen, and we have to be willing to actually rest, to lower our guards, at least with each other. That's terrifying, Pansy said bluntly. Yes, Draco agreed. It is. But outside the windows, the lake water seemed clearer than ever, and the frost patterns glowed with gentle encouragement. The castle was waiting. The lake was waiting. The magic Salazar had woven into these stones a millennium ago was waiting for them to accept what he'd tried to give them. A home, a hearth, a place where serpents could be warm. They just had to be brave enough, Slytherin enough, to take it. The discovery of Salazar Slytherin's journal had shifted something fundamental in the common room's atmosphere. Students moved differently now, spoke more quietly, as if aware they were standing in a place more sacred than they'd previously understood. The journal itself lay open on the table in the alcove, its pages revealing more of Salazar's winter observations as students took turns reading through it. Draco had spent the night poring over the entries, and by morning his understanding of his house's founder had been completely transformed. Salazar wrote about loneliness, his own and his students'. He wrote about the weight of ambition, how it could drive you forward but also isolate you. He wrote about learning to distinguish between strength and hardness, between cunning and cruelty. Today I watched a water snake hunting in the shallows. One entry read, "It moved with such efficiency, such deadly grace. But when the hunt was over, it coiled itself on a sun-warmed rock and simply rested. Even predators know when to stop hunting. Why do we wizards forget this? Why do we think we must always be moving, always proving, always climbing higher?" Now, as pale winter light filtered through the lake water, Draco gathered the group again. Theo had made copies of the most relevant journal passages, with proper preservation charms, refusing to risk the original, and distributed them among the researchers. "Pansy and I will tackle the portraits today," Draco announced. Salazar mentioned in his journal that he shared his discoveries with the other founders. If there are any portraits old enough, they might remember conversations about his enchantment, might know more details about how it's supposed to work. "The rest of us?" Blaise asked. "Keep reading, keep observing. Millicent, see if the house elves know anything about the activation ritual. Theo, cross-reference the journal with any historical texts you can find about Founder-era magic. Daphne, Astoria, keep monitoring the lake. And Crab, Goyle, I need you two to do something specific." Goyle looked up from where he'd been systematically documenting the growth patterns of frost formations. "What?" "Talk to the younger students, the first and second years who stayed for the holidays. They're frightened. I've seen them huddling together, asking questions. Someone needs to explain what's happening in a way that doesn't scare them more." Crab and Goyle exchanged glances, clearly surprised to be given such responsibility. "You're good at that," Draco said simply. "Making people feel safe. I've seen you do it before, with nervous first years on the train, with students who've been bullied. We need that now." A slow smile spread across Crab's face. "All right, we can do that." As the group dispersed to their various tasks, Pansy fell into step beside Draco as they headed for the portrait-lined corridors. She'd been uncharacteristically quiet since reading Salazar's journal, and when she finally spoke, her voice was softer than usual. "Did you ever imagine Salazar Slytherin as lonely?" she asked. Draco thought about the journal entries, the way Salazar had written about sitting by the lake at night, watching the stars reflected in dark water. "No," he admitted. "I always pictured him as self-sufficient, above needing others. But he wasn't," Pansy said. "He built this whole elaborate sanctuary because he understood loneliness, because he'd felt it." She was quiet for a moment. "Makes you wonder what the other founders were like, doesn't it? What they talked about when it was just the four of them, before all the legend and history." They started with the portraits in the main corridors, working their way through former headmasters and distinguished witches and wizards whose painted forms spent eternity hanging in Hogwarts halls. Most knew nothing helpful. Their eras were too recent, their knowledge too focused on their own accomplishments. But then they found Dilys Derwent, whose portrait hung in a drafty corridor near the entrance to the Slytherin common room. She'd been a healer at St. Mungo's in the 17th century before becoming headmistress, and her painted eyes held sharp intelligence. Salazar Slytherin's enchantment, she repeated when Pansy explained their quest. Oh, I know of it. Had it explained to me when I took the headmaster position. Part of understanding the castle's deeper magics. Each founder left something similar for their house, you know. Little gifts tucked into the architecture, meant to activate when students needed them most. Draco leaned forward eagerly. What did the other founders leave? Godric Gryffindor enchanted the tower to show students visions of their own courage during moments of doubt, Dilys said. Helped several students through dark times, that did. Rowena Ravenclaw created a mirror in her common room that reflects not your appearance, but your curiosity, shows you what mysteries you're meant to solve. And Helga Hufflepuff wove growing magic into her common room's plants. They bloom in response to kindness, wilt from cruelty, teaches students to notice the effects of their actions. And Salazar, Pansy pressed. His was always the most complex, Dilys mused, because he was trying to teach the hardest lesson. That ambition without rest becomes destruction, that cunning without trust becomes paranoia, that self-reliance without community becomes isolation. He wanted his students to understand that choosing warmth wasn't weakness, that needing others wasn't failure. How does the enchantment activate fully? Draco asked. We've found his journal. We understand the purpose, but the common room is still freezing. The magic has woken, but not completed. Dilys studied them thoughtfully. The enchantment requires something specific, something Salazar himself struggled with and had to learn. It requires vulnerability, real, genuine vulnerability among students who've been taught their entire lives to hide it. The word hung in the air like frost. Vulnerability, Pansy repeated flatly. You're saying we have to, what? Share our feelings? Have some kind of emotional circle time? I'm saying you have to do what Salazar did when he sat by that lake, Dilys replied. Lower your defenses. Show your actual selves to each other, not the carefully constructed versions you present to the world. The enchantment responds to authenticity. That's impossible, Draco said immediately. We're Slytherins. We can't just... Can't you? Dilys's painted eyebrows rose. Then I suppose you'll continue to freeze. The castle is offering you a gift, but you have to be willing to receive it. They left that portrait, feeling unsettled. The corridor felt colder somehow, and Draco pulled his robes tighter around himself. She's right, you know, Pansy said after a long silence. About us hiding. I do it constantly. The sharp comments, the social maneuvering, the perfect appearance. It's all armor. I barely remember what's underneath anymore. Draco looked at her, really looked. Pansy Parkinson, who never seemed uncertain, whose confidence was legendary, whose tongue could flay someone alive with precisely chosen words. And he saw what he'd been too self-absorbed to notice before. She was exhausted from performing, from maintaining that sharp edge, from never being allowed to just be soft. I'm terrified, most of the time, he found himself saying, the words emerging before he could stop them. Of not living up to my family name, of making the wrong choice, of being seen as weak. I've spent my entire life trying to be what my father wants, what the name Malfoy demands. And I don't even know anymore who I actually am underneath all that. Pansy's eyes widened, and for a moment they just stood there in the empty corridor, two Slytherins who'd accidentally told each other the truth. Well, she said finally, her voice unsteady. That was thoroughly uncomfortable. Completely awful, Draco agreed. We should probably do it again, with the others. Absolutely dreadful idea. The worst. But they both knew they would. They continued their portrait hunt with renewed purpose, finding smaller details and pieces of wisdom. A portrait of a medieval witch mentioned seeing Salazar pacing the corridors late at night, muttering about the problem of pride. A painted wizard from the Renaissance era recalled a conversation with another portrait who'd known Salazar personally, describing him as surprisingly gentle for someone so formidable. But it was in a forgotten classroom, behind a portrait of a landscape that seemed too plain to be noteworthy, that they found something extraordinary. Pansy had noticed the painting only because she'd been examining every portrait they passed, no matter how minor. The landscape showed a lakeshore at sunset, with a small cave visible in the rocks. That's it, Draco breathed. That's the cave, where Salazar lived before the common room was built. As they stared at the painting, something shifted. The landscape seemed to deepen, gain dimension, and suddenly there was a figure standing by the water, a tall man in dark green robes, younger than Draco had expected, watching the sunset with an expression of profound peace. I wondered if any of my snakes would notice this, a voice said, and the painted figure turned to face them. Draco's heart nearly stopped. You're a portrait, the figure confirmed with a slight smile. Obviously, Salazar Slytherin commissioned this himself, late in his life, and asked that it be hidden. He wanted it found only by students who were truly searching, truly questioning. The painted Salazar moved closer, his dark eyes studying them with interest. Tell me, what brings you seeking? Pansy recovered first. Your enchantment is activating. The winter magic, the warmth you built into the dungeons. But it's not complete. We've found your journal. We understand the purpose. But we don't know how to finish it. Ah, Salazar's portrait smiled. You've done well to get this far. Most generations of Slytherins ignore the signs entirely, too busy with their schemes and ambitions to notice the castle trying to teach them. He paused, thoughtful. The enchantment requires unity. Not the false unity of shared goals or mutual advantage. You Slytherins are excellent at that, but real unity, the kind that only comes from honest connection. Dilys Derwent said vulnerability, Draco said. She's right, as usual. Salazar's portrait walked along the painted shore, and they followed, moving along the wall to keep him in view. When I spent that winter by this lake, I learned something about myself, something I hadn't wanted to admit. I was lonely, desperately lonely. I'd spent my whole life believing that needing others was weakness, that true power came from self-sufficiency. And the lake, in its ancient wisdom, showed me how foolish that was. He gestured to the painted water. Look at the lake. It's made of countless individual drops, each one separate, each one unique. But together, they create something greater: depth, current, life. If each drop insisted on remaining isolated, protecting its individuality at all costs. There would be no lake, just scattered puddles, evaporating in the sun. "You're saying we need to be like water," Pansy said slowly. "Individual, but connected." "I'm saying you need to stop pretending you don't need each other," Salazar corrected gently. "The enchantment I built responds to a specific kind of magic, the magic of chosen family, of deliberate community. It activates when Slytherins stop competing and start belonging." "But how?" Draco asked, frustration creeping into his voice. "How do we just suddenly become vulnerable with each other? We've spent years building walls." "You start with truth," Salazar said simply. "Small truths at first. What you fear, what you hope for, what you've hidden because you thought it made you weak. You gather together in the place I sat, in the alcove by my seal, and you speak honestly. The magic will recognize it, the lake will respond, and the warmth I promised will spread through your common room, through your house, through your hearts." He paused, his painted face showing something like compassion. "I know it's difficult. I know everything in your training as Slytherins tells you. This is dangerous. But I also know that loneliness is more dangerous than vulnerability, and isolation is more destructive than trust. I learned that 1,000 years ago, sitting by this lake in the cold. And I built this enchantment so my students wouldn't have to learn it as painfully as I did." Pansy and Draco exchanged glances. The task ahead was clear now, but no less daunting for that clarity. "Will you tell us," Pansy asked hesitantly, "what you were like before you learned to listen to the lake?" Salazar's smile turned sad. "Much like you, I imagine. Proud, ambitious, certain that showing any weakness would invite destruction. I came from a family that valued power above all else, that saw kindness as foolishness and trust as tactical error. I built walls so high I could barely see over them myself." "What changed?" Draco asked. "I got tired," Salazar said softly. "Bone tired, soul tired. Tired of calculating every interaction, of sleeping with one eye open, of treating every person as either tool or threat. And then I spent a winter by this lake, and the water, patient, ancient, knowing, waited until I was ready to hear what it had to teach." He looked at them with those painted eyes that somehow still held warmth. "You're tired too. I can see it. Your whole generation of Slytherins, all of you exhausted from performing, from competing, from being what you think you must be. The castle sees it, the lake sees it, and that's why the enchantment has activated now, because you need it." "What if we can't do it?" Draco asked quietly. "What if we try and fail?" "Then you'll have tried," Salazar said. "And that alone is worth something. But I don't think you'll fail. You've already started, talking to house elves as equals, working together instead of competing, seeking this portrait instead of ignoring the mystery. Those are small acts of trust, small moments of lowering your guards. You just need to do it more deliberately, more completely." A bell chimed somewhere in the castle. Lunchtime. They'd been talking. "To the portrait for over an hour. Go," Salazar said. "Gather your housemates. Read them my journal. Tell them what you've learned. And tonight, when the castle is quiet and the lake is still, come to the alcove. All of you who are willing, sit where I sat, speak your truths, and see if the warmth you've been seeking has been inside you all along. You just needed permission to share it." The portrait began to fade, returning to its simple landscape form. "Wait," Pansy called. Will we see you again? The painted Salazar paused. Perhaps, if you need me. But I suspect, once you've learned what the lake has to teach, you won't need my guidance anymore. You'll have each other. And that, dear students, is the real magic. They walked back to the common room in silence, each processing what they'd learned. When they entered, they found the space transformed by their fellow Slytherins' efforts. Theo had covered an entire wall with parchment, creating a timeline of relevant historical information. The Greengrass sisters had sketched detailed illustrations of how the frost patterns changed hour by hour. Crabbe and Goyle were sitting with 3 first years by the fire, explaining the situation in calm, reassuring voices. Millicent approached them immediately. The house elves confirmed it. They've been preparing for some kind of gathering ritual. They've been setting up the alcove with cushions and blankets, creating what they called a sharing circle. Nipsey said Salazar's enchantment requires speaking from the heart under the witness of deep water. We know, Draco said. We found Salazar's portrait. He explained everything. The common room fell silent as every student turned to listen. Draco found himself looking at their faces, at the curiosity, the fear, the hope visible in their expressions. They were all so young, even the 7th years, all of them trying so hard to be strong, to be worthy of their house, to live up to impossible standards. He wants us to trust each other, Draco said simply. Really trust each other. Tonight, in the alcove, we're going to try to activate the full enchantment. And the only way to do that is to be honest about our fears, our struggles, everything we usually hide. It's completely terrifying and possibly the most Slytherin thing we could do. How is vulnerability Slytherin? One of the first years asked. Because, Pansy said, surprising Draco by answering. It takes more cunning to know when to lower your guard than to keep it up forever. It takes more ambition to build something real than to maintain something fake. And it takes more resourcefulness to ask for help than to pretend you don't need it. Blaise nodded slowly. So we're doing this? Actually doing this? Draco looked around at his housemates, at the ancient stone walls that had sheltered generations of Slytherins, at the lake water pressing against the windows, at the frost patterns that glowed with promise of warmth to come. Yes, he said, tonight, we're going to accept Salazar's gift, together. And though the common room was still cold, though the journey ahead was uncertain, though none of them knew exactly what would happen when they tried to speak their hidden truths, for the first time in days, Draco felt something like hope warming him from within. The lake was waiting, the castle was watching, and the magic of 1,000 years was ready to teach them what Salazar Slytherin had learned in his lonely winter by the water. That home isn't a place. It's the people you choose to be vulnerable with. The hours between discovering Salazar's portrait and nightfall felt both endless and too short. Draco spent the afternoon in a state of anxious anticipation, watching his housemates prepare for something none of them fully understood. The house elves had transformed the alcove into something that looked almost ceremonial. Thick cushions arranged in a circle around Salazar's seal, warming blankets folded neatly nearby, and dozens of floating candles casting soft, flickering light that mingled with the green glow from the lake. By the time darkness fell, or what passed for darkness, in the perpetually twilight dungeons, nearly every Slytherin who'd remained at Hogwarts for the holidays had gathered in the common room. 15 students total, ranging from nervous first years to the 7th-year prefects. They stood in uncertain clusters, talking in hushed voices, clearly aware they were about to attempt something significant. Draco climbed onto one of the tables to address them, feeling ridiculous but needing everyone to hear. "All right," he began, his voice not quite steady. "You all know what we've discovered. Salazar Slytherin's journal, the purpose of this enchantment, what it's meant to teach us. Tonight, we're going to try to activate it fully, but I want to be clear about what that means." He paused, gathering his courage. "It means being honest, really honest, in ways we're taught never to be, about our fears, our insecurities, the things we hide behind our ambition and pride. It means trusting each other with the parts of ourselves we usually protect. And if we can't," a 5th-year girl named Flora asked, her voice small, "what if we try and just can't do it?" "Then we can't," Draco said simply. "No one's forcing anyone. This has to be voluntary. That's part of the magic. But I think," he swallowed hard, "I think most of us are tired. Tired of performing, tired of the cold, tired of being alone even when we're surrounded by people." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the group. "So we try," Pansy added, stepping up beside the table. "We sit in Salazar's place, we speak our truths, and we see what happens. The worst outcome is that nothing changes, and we're exactly where we are now, cold and isolated. The best outcome is that we actually become what Slytherin House was meant to be. Not just a collection of ambitious individuals, but a real community. A home," Astoria Greengrass said softly, and several students nodded. They began moving toward the alcove, settling themselves on the cushions in a rough circle. The first years looked terrified, the older students only slightly less so. Draco took a position directly over Salazar's seal, feeling the ancient magic thrumming beneath him. The frost on the surrounding walls had grown thicker throughout the day, and the patterns now covered every surface, swirls and spirals that seemed to pulse with faint light. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence stretched out, broken only by the distant sound of water lapping against the dungeon walls and the crackle of the common room fires. Finally, Theo cleared his throat. "I suppose someone should start." More silence. Everyone looked at everyone else, waiting for someone to be brave enough or foolish enough to go first. "I'll do it," Draco heard himself say. He hadn't planned to volunteer, but the words emerged anyway, pushed out by something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps responsibility, perhaps exhaustion, perhaps just the need to finally stop carrying everything alone. He took a breath. "My name is Draco Malfoy, and I'm terrified that I don't know who I actually am." The admission hung in the air. Several students stared at him in shock. Draco Malfoy, who always seemed so certain, so confident in his pure blood superiority and family pride. "I've spent my entire life trying to be what my father wants," he continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam breaking. "The perfect heir, the proper Malfoy, someone worthy of our family name. And I've gotten very good at performing that role. But underneath," his voice cracked slightly, "underneath, I don't know what I actually believe, what I actually want. I don't know if the opinions I express are really mine, or just echoes of what I've been taught to think." He looked down at his hands, pale against the dark cushion. "And I'm lonely, so lonely, even though I'm always surrounded by people, because no one actually knows me. How could they, when I don't even know myself? I've built walls so high to protect the Malfoy image that I've trapped myself inside them. The silence that followed felt different now. Not empty, but full, charged with something. "I'm scared of my father," Pansy said suddenly, her voice sharp and defiant, as if daring anyone to judge her. Not physically, he's never raised a hand to me, but his disappointment is like ice in my chest. I spend every waking moment trying to be perfect enough, connected enough, valuable enough that he'll actually see me as something other than a chess piece, to be married off advantageously. Her hands twisted in her lap. And I know I'm cruel sometimes, with my words, with my judgments. I know people think I'm heartless, but it's easier to strike first than to be vulnerable, easier to tear others down than to risk them seeing that I'm barely holding myself together most of the time. Blaise was next, his usual lazy elegance stripped away. I pretend nothing matters to me, that I'm above it all, detached, untouchable. But the truth is, I care desperately about everything, and it hurts. My mother's been married 7 times. 7. I learned young that attachment meant pain, that caring meant losing. So I stopped letting myself care, or pretended to. But pretending is exhausting and lonely, and sometimes I just want to. He trailed off, shaking his head. "Want to what?" Daphne Greengrass prompted gently. "Wanna cry," Blaise admitted, his voice barely audible. "Wanna scream. Wanna be angry instead of urbane, passionate instead of cool. Want to be real instead of this carefully constructed person I've made myself into." Theo spoke without being prompted. "I can't sleep most nights. I have nightmares about becoming like my father, about the darkness in our family history catching up to me, corrupting me. I bury myself in books and research because knowledge feels safer than feelings. Because if I'm always studying, I don't have time to think about how much I hate going home for holidays, how much I dread the future my family has planned for me." One by one, they continued. Millicent admitted she pretended to be tougher than she felt because showing softness had always gotten her hurt. The Greengrass sisters talked about the weight of pure blood expectations, how exhausting it was to maintain perfect appearances, perfect manners, perfect everything. Flora confessed she'd been sorted into Slytherin because she was ambitious, but her ambition was simply to be good enough, to not be a disappointment. When it came to the first years, a tiny girl named Celeste spoke up, her voice trembling. "I miss my parents. I know that's stupid. Everyone lives away from home at Hogwarts, but I'm only 11, and I'm scared all the time, and everyone expects me to be cunning and ambitious, and I just want someone to tell me it's okay to be homesick." "It is okay," Crabbe said immediately, his deep voice gentle. "It's completely okay." "I always feel stupid," Goyle added, surprising everyone. "People think Crabbe and I are just muscle, just followers, and we've learned to play into that because it's easier than trying to prove we're more. But I notice things, details, patterns, how people move through space. I'm good at that. I just never know how to explain it in a way that sounds intelligent." "You are intelligent," Astoria said firmly. "Different kinds of intelligence exist. The way you mapped the frost patterns, that was brilliant." Goyle's face flushed with pleasure, and Draco felt something warm unfurl in his chest. The confessions continued, each one building on the others, creating a tapestry of shared struggle and hidden pain. They talked about family pressure and social expectations, about the exhaustion of constant performance, about the specific loneliness of being a Slytherin, expected to be strong, cunning, self-sufficient, never admitting weakness or need. I thought being sorted into Slytherin meant I'd found my people, a third-year boy named Marcus said. But it just meant I'd found more people to compete against, more people to hide from. Maybe that's what Salazar wanted to change, Pansy said softly. Maybe he knew that ambition without community just makes you alone at the top of a very cold mountain. The frost on the walls had begun to glow brighter as they spoke, pulsing in rhythm with their confessions. The temperature in the alcove, while still cool, felt less oppressive, as if the very act of speaking truth was generating its own warmth. Draco felt tears on his face and was surprised to realize he was crying. Not dramatically, not with sobs, just silent tears that tracked down his cheeks as he listened to his housemates share their hidden selves. Around the circle, others were crying too. Pansy with her face in her hands, Theo with tears dripping onto his robes, the first years clutching each other. "I don't want to be cold anymore," Draco said, his voice breaking. "I don't want to spend my life calculating every interaction, sleeping with one eye open, treating everyone as either tool or threat. I want—" He looked around at the faces in the circle, all of them vulnerable, all of them brave. "I want this truth, this connection. I want to know you all really, not just the versions we show to the world. And I want you to know me." "Even the scared parts?" Flora asked. "Especially the scared parts," Draco said, "because those are the parts that need warmth the most." The light from the frost patterns suddenly intensified, blazing silver green, and they all gasped. The seal beneath Draco began to glow, warming against his legs. The temperature in the alcove rose perceptibly, and the change rippled outward. They could see it happening. Watch the frost on the walls begin to shift and transform. But it wasn't melting. Instead, it was reforming, the ice crystals rearranging themselves into something new. Images began to appear in the frost. 15 figures sitting in a circle, holding hands. The same scene repeated across every frosted surface, fractal and infinite, showing them to themselves, vulnerable, connected, choosing warmth together. "It's working," Astoria breathed. The lake water beyond the windows began to brighten, that silver-green light spreading through it like dawn. Shapes moved in the depths, not threatening, but curious. The merpeople had come to watch, their faces pressed to the glass. The giant squid unfurled its tentacles in what might have been celebration. Even the Grindylows seemed calmer, less aggressive. And then, from somewhere deep in the stone itself, they heard it. A voice that might have been wind, might have been water, might have been magic itself. "Welcome home," it seemed to say. "Welcome home, little serpents. You have learned what I waited so long to teach you." The warmth spread faster now, flowing through the common room like water, like light, like love. The fireplaces blazed brighter without burning hotter, their flames taking on that same silver-green tint. The cushions and blankets softened, became more inviting. Even the stone walls seemed to lose their harsh chill, transforming into something that felt sheltering rather than confining. But more than the physical changes, something had shifted in the students themselves. The walls they'd built around their hearts hadn't disappeared. Slytherins would always be cautious, always be strategic. But they'd been lowered just enough to let warmth in, to let connection through. Draco looked around the circle and saw his housemates seeing each other truly for the first time, not as competitors or useful connections, but as people, scared, ambitious, lonely people who'd all been taught to hide their needs and were now, finally, allowing themselves to be seen. So this is what Salazar meant, Theo said wonderingly. By home, not a place where you're comfortable, but a place where you're known, where you can rest because you don't have to perform. A place where serpents can coil together for warmth, Millicent added, without worrying about being struck. Pansy reached out and took Draco's hand, then extended her other hand to Blay. Slowly, around the circle, they all joined hands. 15 Slytherins choosing connection over isolation, vulnerability over armor, warmth over pride. And the ancient magic that Salazar Slytherin had woven into these stones 1,000 years ago finally, fully, bloomed to life. The moment their hands connected around the circle, everything changed. The glow from Salazar's seal intensified, becoming almost too bright to look at directly. Draco felt warmth spreading up through the stone beneath him. Not the harsh heat of fire, but something gentler, more profound. It felt like being held, like being welcomed home after a long, cold journey. The light spread outward from the seal in visible waves, rippling across the floor like water. Where it touched, frost dissolved into mist that hung in the air, sparkling with that distinctive silver-green luminescence. The mist swirled upward, gathering near the vaulted ceiling, before beginning to descend again as something new. Not snow, but something similar. Tiny crystalline flakes that glowed softly as they drifted down, each one carrying warmth instead of cold. "It's beautiful," Celeste whispered, one of the magical flakes landing on her outstretched palm. It didn't melt, just sat there glowing gently, pulsing with the rhythm of her heartbeat before dissolving into pure warmth that spread up her arm. The windows looking out into the lake blazed with light now, and through them, Draco could see the water itself transforming. The murky green was gone entirely, replaced by crystal clarity that extended far deeper than should have been possible. And in that clarity, moving through the water with deliberate grace, came the merpeople. There were dozens of them, swimming in synchronized patterns that seemed almost like a dance. Their wild hair flowed behind them, and their sharp features were softened by expressions of what could only be described as joy. They pressed their palms to the glass, and where they touched, new patterns bloomed in the stone around the windows, ancient symbols that Draco recognized from Salazar's journal. Protection signs, welcome markers, blessings. "They're celebrating," Daphne breathed. "They remember. The merpeople remember when Salazar first activated this enchantment, and they're celebrating that it's happening again." One of the mermen, older than the others, his face weathered and wise, met Draco's eyes through the glass. The creature smiled, revealing sharp teeth that somehow weren't threatening, and raised a hand in salute. Then he sang. The sound penetrated the stone and glass as if they weren't there at all, a wordless melody that resonated in Draco's chest, in his bones, in his magic itself. It was a song of welcome, of belonging, of home. The other merpeople joined in, their voices creating harmonies that seemed to tell the story of the lake itself, of its ancient magic, its patience, its willingness to teach those who would listen. Around the circle, students began to hum along without conscious thought, their voices blending with the merman's song. The sound grew, built, transformed into something that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite magic, but existed somewhere between the two. Pure expression of connection, of community, of choosing warmth together. The house elves appeared then, popping into existence around the alcove. Nipsey was at the front, his enormous eyes streaming with tears of happiness. Behind him, at least 20 other elves stood watching, their small hands clasped together. "The magic remembers," Nipsey said, his voice choked with emotion. "After so many years of sleeping, the magic remembers what Hogwarts was meant to feel like, what Slytherin House was meant to be." "You've been maintaining this enchantment all along," Theo realized. "For 1,000 years, house elves have been keeping it ready, keeping it alive, waiting for students who would accept the gift." "It is an honor," Nipsey said simply. "Salazar Slytherin, he understood house elves. He knew we serves best when we serves with love, not fear. He built kindness into his house's foundation, even though history forgot that part of him." The elves raised their hands together, and the magic in the room surged in response. The floating candles multiplied, hundreds of them now, casting warm light that danced across every surface. The cushions beneath the students became even softer, the blankets warmer. Throughout the common room, beyond the alcove, furniture rearranged itself into more welcoming configurations, sofas drawing closer together, tables shifting to create intimate study spaces, bookshelves organizing themselves by comfort rather than strict alphabetical order. "Look at the ceiling," Marcus called out, pointing upward. The stone ceiling, usually barely visible in the dungeon's gloom, had transformed entirely. It now showed the lake's surface from below, as if they were looking up through the water itself. They could see the frozen surface far above, the ice that had formed thick and white across the top. But even as they watched, cracks began to appear in the ice, not breaking dangerously, but creating patterns, letting pale winter light filter through in shafts that penetrated the water and reached down to them. And swimming through those shafts of light, moving with impossible grace, were shapes. Fish, yes, but also water spirits, translucent beings made of lake water and ancient magic, dancing through their element in celebration. "The lake spirits," Flora whispered in awe. "I read about them, but I thought they were just legends." "Everything is real," a voice said, and they all turned to see that Salazar's portrait had appeared on the wall of the alcove, somehow transporting itself from its hidden classroom. The painted Salazar stood on his painted shore, watching them with an expression of profound satisfaction. "Magic this old, this pure, it makes manifest the things that usually hide between reality and dream. You've broken through more than ice tonight. You've broken through the barriers that keep magic separate from the heart." Draco felt something shifting inside himself, as if pieces that had been scattered were finally coming together. The warmth from the seal had spread through his entire body now, and with it came a clarity he'd never experienced before. He could feel his housemates' presence in a new way. Not their thoughts, nothing so intrusive, but their emotional states. Pansy's fierce relief, Blaze's cautious hope, Theo's wondering joy, the first year's pure delight. "Is this what you meant?" he asked Salazar's portrait. "About connection. We can feel each other now." "The enchantment creates bonds," Salazar confirmed. "Not controlling bonds, not invasive ones. You're still entirely yourselves, still entirely free. But yes, you can sense each other's emotional truth now. It makes lying to each other, rather difficult. His painted face showed amusement. I thought that was important for Slytherins especially. You're so skilled at deception that sometimes you deceive yourselves. This way, you'll always know when one of you is hurting, even if they try to hide it. That's terrifying, Pansy said, but she was smiling. And perfect. Absolutely perfect. The magical snowfall intensified, the glowing flakes swirling around them in gentle spirals. Where they landed on students, they didn't just dissolve. They left behind tiny marks, delicate silver-green patterns on skin that looked almost like tattoos, but felt like warmth pressed into flesh. "What are these?" Millicent asked, examining the pattern on her wrist. It looked like a tiny serpent made of water, coiled in a high, perfect spiral. "Marks of the Covenant," Salazar explained. "Physical proof of the bonds you've chosen. They'll fade in time, a few days, perhaps a week. But while they last, they'll remind you of what you discovered here. And they'll help others who carry the marks recognize each other. Should you ever need to find your way back to this feeling." Goyle had a mark behind his ear, Thao on his collarbone, the Greengrass sisters on their shoulders where they mirrored each other. Each mark was slightly different, reflecting something essential about the person who carried it, but all were recognizably part of the same magic. The transformation of the common room was accelerating now. The harsh stone walls were softening, not literally, but in feeling. The green-tinted light from the lake had brightened to something almost cheerful. The furniture looked more comfortable, more lived in, more loved. Even the shadows in the corners seemed warmer somehow, inviting rather than threatening. But the most dramatic change was in the alcove itself, where Salazar's seal had been carved into the floor. Now a shallow pool was forming, not water from the lake, but something else. Pure magic made liquid, silver-green and luminous, swirling gently in a depression that seemed to deepen as they watched. "The heart pool," Nipsey breathed reverently. "House elves has only heard stories, never seen it in our lifetime." "What does it do?" Astoria asked. Salazar's portrait moved closer, peering down at the pool with evident satisfaction. "It reflects truth. Look into it, and you'll see not your face, but your heart, who you are beneath all the armor and performance. I created it as a gift for my students, a way for them to remember themselves when the world demands they be something else." One by one, the students leaned forward to look into the pool. Draco saw Pansy's face transform as she gazed at her reflection. Whatever she saw there brought tears to her eyes, but she was smiling. Blaze looked and let out a shaky laugh. The first years approached hesitantly, but came away looking stronger, more certain. When Draco's turn came, he knelt at the pool's edge and looked down into the liquid magic. His reflection stared back at him, but it was wrong. No, not wrong. Right. More right than any mirror had ever shown him. The face looking back was his, but younger somehow, less burdened. The grey eyes held warmth instead of calculation, the mouth curved in a genuine smile rather than a smirk. This version of Draco Malfoy looked happy, genuinely happy in a way he couldn't remember ever feeling in real life. And behind that reflection, he saw others, his housemates, all of them, standing with him. Not behind him in a hierarchy, but beside him as equals, as friends, as family chosen rather than inherited. "This is who you could be," the pool seemed to whisper. "This is who you are, underneath everything else. Ambitious still, yes, clever, determined, proud, but also warm, Also kind, also capable of love. Draco pulled back from the pool, his hands shaking. I saw. Hope, Pansy finished for him. She'd been watching his face, reading his emotions through their new bond. You saw hope. So did I. So did all of us, I think. The magical snowfall began to slow, the glowing flakes becoming less frequent as the enchantment settled into its final form. The light from the seal stabilized at a warm, gentle glow rather than its earlier blazing intensity. Throughout the common room, everything stilled into a new equilibrium. Not the cold, harsh space they'd endured for days, but something entirely different. Something that felt genuinely like home. Theo stood up, stretching limbs that had gone stiff from sitting so long, and looked around with wonder. How long have we been here? A glance at the ornate clock on the mantelpiece showed that hours had passed. It was well past midnight, sliding into the early hours of morning. But none of them felt tired. If anything, they felt energized, renewed, as if they'd been sleeping for years and had only just woken up. We should see what's changed, Blaise suggested. In the rest of the common room. They rose together, still instinctively staying close to each other, and ventured out of the alcove. What they found took their breath away. The common room had transformed into something from a dream. The walls, while still stone, now had warmth radiating from them. Not heat exactly, but a feeling of shelter, of security. Tapestries had appeared that Draco had never seen before, showing scenes from Slytherin history he'd never learned. Salazar sitting by the lake with a young student, teaching patiently. Slytherin students from centuries past gathered in circles, just like the one they'd formed tonight, sharing stories and laughter. The founders themselves, all four together, looking not like the stern figures from official portraits, but like friends. Arguing, yes, but with affection underlying the disputes. The furniture had rearranged itself into conversation clusters that actually invited people to sit and talk rather than maintain formal distance. Bookshelves now held not just academic texts, but novels, poetry, even silly magazines. A corner that had always been cold and unused now featured comfortable chairs arranged around a new fireplace that burned with silver-green flames. It's like the common room finally exhaled, Daphne said softly, like it was holding its breath for 1,000 years, waiting for this. In the windows, the view of the lake had become even more spectacular. The water teemed with life now, fish schooling in swirling patterns, water spirits dancing between the rays of filtered moonlight, merpeople swimming past in friendly patrols. The giant squid had positioned itself directly before the main window and appeared to be waving. Its tentacle moved in a clear gesture of greeting. Crab approached the glass and waved back, grinning. The squid's eye, the size of a dinner plate, sparkled with what looked remarkably like amusement. I think Hogwarts' creatures have been waiting for this too, he said. For Slytherins to remember that we're part of the castle's ecosystem, not separate from it. The house elves had been busy while they explored. The long tables were now laden with food. Not formal feast food, but comfort food. Hot chocolate with marshmallows, fresh pastries, warm soup, sandwiches cut into triangles, biscuits and cakes. Comfort food, celebration food, food meant to be shared among friends. Please, young masters and mistresses, eat, Nipsey urged. You has done powerful magic tonight. You must restore yourselves. They gathered around the tables, and for the first time in Draco's memory, There was no jockeying for position, no careful consideration of who sat where in the hierarchy. People simply sat with those they wanted to be near, and the conversation that arose was genuine. Not performance, not strategy, just connection. Flora ended up between Goyle and Millicent, and both older students were patient with her questions, explaining things without condescension. The Greengrass sisters sat with Marcus and a few other middle years, discussing what classes they were most excited about next term. Theo had cornered Blay and was enthusiastically explaining some historical detail he'd uncovered, and Blay was actually listening, asking questions, engaging, and Draco found himself sitting between Pansy and Crab, eating warm soup and feeling content. Actually content, maybe for the first time in his life. The anxiety that usually hummed beneath his skin had quieted. The constant calculation of advantage and disadvantage had stilled. For this moment, at least, he could just be. "Do you think it will last?" Pansy asked quietly, reading his emotional state through their bond. "This feeling, or will we wake up tomorrow and go back to how things were?" Draco considered the question carefully. "I think we'll wake up tomorrow and still be Slytherins. Still ambitious, still cunning, still all the things we are. But we'll also remember this." He gestured around the transformed common room, at their housemates relaxing together. "We'll remember that we don't have to be cold, that we can be warm and still be strong. That vulnerability isn't weakness," Theo added, overhearing. "That connection isn't liability. That home is possible," Blaze finished, "even for serpents." Salazar's portrait had followed them, manifesting on the wall above the main fireplace, where it commanded a view of the entire common room. The painted Salazar watched his students with an expression of deep satisfaction. "You've done well," he said, his voice carrying to every corner despite being just a painting. "Better than most generations. You've not just activated the enchantment, you've understood it. You've taken the lesson to heart. Will you stay?" Celeste asked shyly. "In this portrait, I mean. So, we can talk to you sometimes." Salazar's smile was gentle. "For a while, perhaps, until you don't need me anymore. But I suspect that won't be long. You have each other now. You have this place, this home you've created together. And you have the knowledge that when winter comes again, literal or metaphorical, you know how to find warmth." The silver-green flames in the fireplace crackled and popped, sending up showers of sparks that transformed into tiny butterflies of light before dissolving. Outside the windows, the first hints of dawn were beginning to show through the lake water. Pale light that turned the ice above into stained glass. They'd stayed up all night, Draco realized, talking, sharing, building something new from the ruins of their old isolation. And he didn't feel tired at all. He felt alive, awake, present in a way he'd never quite managed before. "Thank you," he said, addressing Salazar's portrait directly, "for building this, for believing that Slytherins could learn to be warm." "Thank the lake," Salazar replied. "I just listened to what it taught me. The magic was always here, waiting. You simply had to be brave enough, Slytherin enough, to accept the gift." As dawn broke fully over Hogwarts, sending light cascading through the lake water and into their transformed common room, 15 Slytherins sat together in warmth they'd created themselves. The enchantment was complete. The lesson was learned. And for the first time in 1,000 years, Salazar Slytherin's deepest wish for his students had finally, fully come true. They had found home. Morning light filtered through the lake in shades of silver and green, painting shifting patterns across the Slytherin common room's stone walls. Draco woke slowly, aware first of warmth. Real, genuine warmth that he couldn't remember feeling in the dungeons before. He was curled up on one of the sofas near the main fireplace. A thick blanket draped over him that smelled faintly of lake water and magic. Around him, his housemates were scattered throughout the common room in various states of wakefulness. Some were still sleeping, draped across furniture in positions that would have been considered completely improper yesterday, but now just looked comfortable. Pansy was curled in an armchair, her usually perfect hair mussed and her face peaceful. Theo had fallen asleep with a book on his chest, his glasses askew. The first years were piled together on a large rug near the heart pool, which still glowed softly in the alcove. Draco sat up carefully, not wanting to disturb anyone, and simply observed. The transformation from last night hadn't been a dream. The common room was still changed, still warm, still welcoming, still home in a way it had never been before. The tapestries showing Salazar's gentler history remained on the walls. The furniture stayed in its comfortable configurations. The silver-green flames burned steadily in the fireplace, casting light that felt like a blessing. He stood and made his way to the windows, drawn by the need to see the lake in full daylight. What he found took his breath away all over again. The water was still crystal clear, clearer even than last night. Fish moved in lazy schools, their scales catching the morning light. The giant squid was closer to the surface now, its massive body outlined against the frozen ceiling of ice far above. And the merpeople, they were everywhere, swimming in groups, tending to what looked like gardens of aquatic plants near the castle's foundation, occasionally waving when they spotted him watching. But it was what lay on the lakebed that caught his attention. Patterns had been drawn there in the sand and silt, intricate designs that must have taken hours to create. From this angle, Draco could see they formed words in an ancient script he almost recognized from his study of Salazar's journal. Welcome, belong, home, always. The merpeople had left them a message, a blessing from the lake's oldest inhabitants, acknowledging what the students had achieved. They did that while we slept, a voice said, and Draco turned to find Daphne standing beside him, wrapped in a blanket and looking out at the water. I've been watching for about 20 minutes. They're so careful with the patterns, making sure every line is perfect. They remember, Draco said softly. Salazar wrote about becoming friends with the merpeople during his winter by the lake. They taught him songs, told him stories about the water's magic. They're honoring that memory. Honoring us, Daphne corrected gently, for choosing to learn what he tried to teach. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the underwater world wake fully to the day. More students began stirring behind them, and Draco heard the soft murmur of morning conversations, the gentle sounds of people waking in a place they felt safe. Blaze appeared carrying cups of tea. House elves must have delivered them while everyone slept and distributed them to the early risers. I had the strangest dreams, he said, settling onto a window seat. Or maybe they were memories. I kept seeing the lake, but from different angles, different times, like I was experiencing Salazar's winter along with him. Me too, Daphne admitted. I dreamed I was sitting on the shore in snow, and the water was speaking to me, not in words, but in feelings, telling me I was home. The enchantment works through dreams too, Theo said, joining them. He'd apparently woken when Blaise started moving around. I read something about it in one of Salazar's journal entries I studied last night. The magic doesn't just change the physical space. It changes how we perceive ourselves, helps us internalize the lessons so they become part of us, rather than just intellectual knowledge. Pansy emerged from her armchair, stretching like a cat. So, we're all going to be disgustingly emotionally healthy now. How very un-Slytherin. But she was smiling as she said it, and through their bond, Draco could feel her contentment, her relief, her joy at waking up in a place that finally felt right. I think we're going to be Slytherin, in a way Slytherins haven't been for a long time, he said. Ambitious still, yes. Cunning and resourceful and determined, but also connected, Millicent supplied, appearing from the direction of the dormitories. I checked on the younger students. They're still asleep, but they look so peaceful. When's the last time you saw first years look that relaxed? Never, Goyle said simply, helping Crabbe distribute pastries that had appeared on the tables. The house elves were still providing, still caring, but now it felt like family taking care of family rather than servants performing duties. As the morning progressed and everyone woke fully, they gathered naturally in the center of the common room. Not formally. There was no meeting called, no agenda set. People simply gravitated together, drawn by the bonds they'd forged the night before. The marks on their skin, the tiny serpent patterns left by the magical snowfall, were still visible, though slightly faded. Celeste kept touching hers wonderingly, as if afraid it would disappear. Marcus kept rolling up his sleeve to check that his was still there. Even Draco found himself absently tracing the pattern on his collarbone, reassuring himself that last night had been real. What happens when other students return? Flora asked, voicing the question several people had been thinking. After the holidays, when everyone comes back, will they understand? Will the common room stay this way? The physical changes will remain, Theo said thoughtfully. Those are permanent, part of the castle's structure, now that the enchantment is fully activated. But the feeling, I think that depends on us. On whether we maintain what we built, Astoria agreed. On whether we choose to keep being honest with each other, to keep the walls down. It won't be easy, Pansy said pragmatically. We're still going to have conflicts. We're still going to compete. That's part of being Slytherin. But maybe we can compete without cruelty, succeed without isolating ourselves. We can show the others, Crabbe suggested, when they come back. The first years especially, they're still learning what Slytherin means. We can teach them it means this. He gestured around at the warm common room, at their group gathered together. Not just ambition and cunning, but also belonging. Draco thought about the returning students, the ones who'd gone home for the holidays and would come back to find their common room transformed. Some would embrace the change immediately. Others would be suspicious, would resist, would cling to the old ways of competition and isolation because that felt safer. But the magic was active now. The enchantment was working. And every Slytherin who sat in the alcove, who looked into the heart pool, who allowed themselves to feel the castle's welcome, they would have the opportunity to learn what Salazar had tried to teach. We'll be examples, he said firmly. Not perfect. We're still going to make mistakes, still going to sometimes fall back into old patterns. But we'll keep coming back to this. He touched his mark, to what we learned here, and we'll help others learn it too. Salazar's portrait, which had been quietly observing from above the fireplace, spoke for the first time that morning. You understand now why I built this the way I did, why the enchantment requires such specific circumstances to activate. It's not meant to work constantly. That would make it meaningless. It's meant to wake during the hardest winters, when students are most at risk of forgetting their humanity in their pursuit of ambition. It's a reset button, Blaise said, understanding dawning in his eyes. Every generation or so, when Slytherin House has drifted too far into coldness, the enchantment activates and reminds us what we're supposed to be. Precisely, Salazar confirmed. And those who experience it, like you 15, become the keepers of the lesson. You'll graduate eventually, go out into the world, but you'll carry this warmth with you, and in your own ways, you'll teach it to others. That's how change happens, not through grand pronouncements or forced transformation, but through individuals choosing connection and then sharing that choice with those around them. The weight of that responsibility settled over the group, but it didn't feel crushing. It felt right, meaningful. What about you? Celeste asked the portrait. Will you stay with us? Salazar's painted face softened. For a while longer, until I'm certain you don't need me anymore. But my time is long past. This is your era, your chance to define what Slytherin means for your generation. I'm merely an echo, a reminder of where you came from. The future is yours to shape. The morning continued its gentle progression. Students ate breakfast together, shared more stories, explored the transformed common room, and discovered details they'd missed in last night's excitement. Someone found that the heart pool could show not just individual truth, but shared memories. When multiple people looked into it together, they could see moments from each other's lives, building empathy and understanding. The library corner had expanded, filled with books on emotional intelligence and healthy relationships, alongside the usual texts on dark magic and defensive spells. A notice board had appeared that encouraged students to post not just academic achievements, but acts of kindness, moments of vulnerability, celebrations of mutual support. It's like the room is actively trying to teach us how to be better, Marcus observed. Not better at magic, better at being human. That was always Salazar's real ambition, Theo said, gesturing to the portrait. Not just to create powerful wizards, but to create whole people. Ones who understood that strength without compassion was just brutality, ambition without ethics was just greed. As afternoon approached, students began drifting naturally into individual activities while remaining in the communal space. Some read, some played chess, some simply talked. But everyone stayed in the common room rather than retreating to dormitories, drawn by the warmth, by the connection, by the simple pleasure of being together. Draco found himself back at the alcove, looking down at the heart pool. The liquid magic within had stilled to a mirror-like surface, and gazing into it now, he saw something different than this morning. Not just his own potential self, but a vision of the future. He saw himself older, not much, maybe just a year or two, standing in this same common room surrounded by students, teaching them something, showing them how to maintain the enchantment, how to keep the warmth alive. He saw Pansy beside him, her sharp wit tempered with genuine care. He saw Theo documenting everything for future generations, creating a guide to Salazar's true legacy. He saw all of them, grown into the people they'd glimpsed in the pool last night. "That's what we're becoming," Pansy said, appearing beside him and looking into the pool. "Not perfect, but better, more whole, more ourselves," Draco agreed. The light shifted outside, and they looked up to see that the ice on the lake's surface was finally beginning to break. Not catastrophically. There would be no flooding, no danger, but gentle cracks spread across the frozen ceiling, letting more light through, signaling that even this deep winter was beginning to ease. "Spring will come," Astoria said, noticing the same thing. "Winter can't last forever." "But we'll remember it," Goyle added. "This winter, what we learned here, what we became." A chime echoed through the castle, the signal that dinner was being served in the great hall. For the first time in days, the thought of leaving the common room didn't feel uncomfortable. They'd created their sanctuary, but they didn't need to hide in it. They could carry its warmth with them wherever they went. As the group prepared to head upstairs, pulling on warmer robes and organizing themselves, Draco took one last look around the transformed space. The silver-green flames still burned steadily. The tapestries still showed Salazar's gentler truth. The heart pool still glowed in its alcove. And throughout it all, an almost palpable sense of welcome, of home, of belonging. "Thank you," he said quietly, addressing the castle itself, the lake, the magic that had taught them so much, for not giving up on us, for waiting until we were ready to learn. He felt something in response. Not words, but a feeling. Affection, perhaps. Pride. The castle's own form of love for students who'd finally understood what it had been trying to teach them for 1,000 years. They walked together through the dungeons, 15 Slytherins, whose marks of a connection were visible on their skin, whose bond could be felt by anyone paying attention, whose warmth radiated outward like light. Other students they passed, Ravenclaws heading to their tower, Hufflepuffs returning from the kitchens, paused and stared, sensing something different but unable to quite name it. In the great hall, Professor Snape looked up from the head table as they entered. His expression remained characteristically stern, but Draco thought he saw something shift in the potions master's dark eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Understanding. As if Snape knew exactly what had happened in the Slytherin common room and approved. They took their seats at the Slytherin table, but differently than before. Instead of spacing themselves out in careful hierarchy, maintaining proper distance and competitive positioning, they sat together, close, connected, a family. Conversation flowed easily through dinner, not just the usual discussion of classes and grades and social maneuvering, but real talk, plans for how to maintain their newfound connection, ideas for helping other Slytherins understand what was possible, dreams for what their house could become. "We should start a tradition," Flora suggested shyly. "Weekly gatherings in the alcove, not mandatory, but available for anyone who needs to reconnect, who needs to remember. Story circles," Millicent added, "where we share not just our achievements, but our struggles. Keep practicing vulnerability so it doesn't become foreign again." "And we protect the younger students," Crabbe said firmly. "Make sure they know from day one that Slytherin means community, not just competition." The ideas multiplied, built on each other, created a vision of what Slytherin House could be. not a rejection of ambition or cunning. Those traits were still valued, still essential. But ambition in service of something larger than individual success. Cunning used to solve problems and protect community rather than exploit others. As dinner concluded and students began dispersing to various activities, Draco found himself heading not to the library to study or to some quiet corner to brood his usual evening habits, but back to the common room with his housemates, back to the warmth they'd created together. The evening passed in comfortable companionship. Some students worked on homework, but together, helping each other rather than hoarding knowledge. Others played games, read aloud to each other, or simply talked. The first years were taught a card game by the older students, and their delighted laughter filled the space. As midnight approached, Draco stood once more at the window, watching the merpeople's final patrols of the day. The marks on his skin had faded further. By tomorrow, they'd probably be invisible. But that was all right. The real mark, the one that mattered, was carved into his heart now, into all their hearts. Pansy joined him at the window, slipping her arm through his in easy affection that would have been unthinkable a week ago. "Do you think we'll forget?" she asked quietly. "Once enough time passes, once the marks are completely gone, once the urgency of this moment fades, do you think we'll go back to who we were?" Draco considered the question seriously. "I think we'll sometimes slip into old patterns. I think there will be days when it's easier to be cold than warm, when isolation seems safer than connection. But I also think—" He touched his chest, where the mark had been strongest. "I think we've changed something fundamental. We've seen what's possible. And once you've seen that, really seen it, you can't fully unsee it. We'll remind each other," she said firmly. "When one of us forgets, the others will remember. That's what community means, right? Holding the truth for each other when we lose sight of it ourselves." "Right," he agreed. They stood together in silence, watching the underwater world, feeling the warmth of the common room at their backs and the warmth of connection in their hearts. The castle creaked and settled around them, ancient stones holding ancient magic, patient and eternal. Tomorrow, the holidays would continue. Soon, other students would return. Life would go on, bringing its usual challenges and conflicts and moments of doubt. But here in the depths, beneath the lake, where Salazar Slytherin had once learned to listen, something had fundamentally changed. 15 serpents had learned that they didn't have to be cold. That warmth was not weakness. That vulnerability was not failure. That home was not just a place but a practice, a daily choice to stay connected, to remain open, to keep choosing each other, despite everything. Draco looked out at the lake's dark water, at the frost patterns still visible on the windows, though now they seemed more like decoration than warning. He thought about Salazar sitting in his cave 1,000 years ago, cold and lonely, and learning the lesson that would shape his house's deepest magic. "Thank you for listening," he thought, directing the words to that long-dead founder whose wisdom had finally found students ready to receive it. "Thank you for building us this sanctuary. Thank you for believing we could learn to be warm." And deep in the stone, in the water, in the magic woven through the castle's foundations, he felt an answer. Not words, but a feeling that resonated through his bones, his blood, his very soul. "Welcome home, little serpent. Welcome home." The silver-green flames in the fireplace crackled and popped, sending up sparks that transformed into tiny butterflies of light. Outside the windows, the merpeople sang their evening songs, and in the Slytherin common room, deep beneath the frozen lake, warmth endured. Not the warmth of fire that burns and consumes, but the warmth of hearts choosing connection. The warmth of belonging, of being truly seen and accepted. The warmth that Salazar Slytherin had discovered a millennium ago and had spent the rest of his life trying to give to his students. The warmth that finally, after 1,000 years of waiting, had found a home.